with Your Majesty's permission. I'd like to welcome you all to this session. This session is titled The Writer's Life, Balancing Creativity and Commercial Success. And it is a great pleasure to have with me Mr. Ashwin Sanghi, who is a very prolific writer, one of India's biggest selling authors. And he has also been very praised for his innovative blend of mythology and science fiction, history, thriller, and you name the genre and he's touched upon it. And who better to tell us about balancing creativity and commercial success than Ashwin? And
There's one person in the audience. Shobha Dey is right here. She started the trend. When we didn't even know how to get the alphabets on the paper, she was already there.
Of course, this isn't your first time in Bhutan, and this isn't your first time at the festival either. Welcome back, Ashwin.
Thank you. As I was joking with the Queen Mother, that as far as Bhutan goes, there is a lot of deep love and adoration for this land. And at the top of that list, the number one attraction is the Queen Mother herself. I have yet not come across a more beautiful soul than her. So thank you for your friendship, Your Majesty. And the second, of course, is the land and its people. I was joking with her that when I travel from Paro to Thimphu, normally one wants the trip to be shorter. One is wondering, when is this trip going to end? But in this case, you want it to be extended because you're taking in the rivers, you're taking in the trees, you're taking in the mountains. What a beautiful land. What a lovely, lovely sentiment and vibe that Bhutan creates. How can you not fall in love with this country? I think. And then, of course, the added icing on the cake is that you produce wonderful whiskey. I mean, K5, honestly, Okay, sorry.
I'm glad you enjoyed the place so much that I think we even featured as a setting for one of your novels.
I think the openings, in fact, in two novels. Bhutan featured in a book called the Sialkot Saga. In fact, part of that book was written during one of the festivals here. So I think maybe around 3 or 4 chapters of that book were written here. And there was another book, The Vault of Vishnu, where the opening sequence was in Bhutan, but that was not in such a happy situation. It was Doklam.
Right. Let's take you back to the beginning of your writing career. You published your first book in your mid-30s.
Utsav, I'm still at the beginning of my writing career. I'm a babe in the woods. I've just come on the scene, and I try and convince myself every day that I still have a long, long way ahead of me. So, I genuinely hope that I'm at the beginning of that journey.
We all hope the same, that you have a long career ahead of you. But you actually published your book, in your mid-30s after a career in business. You actually had an education in business. Was writing something always on the horizon for you, or was it something that, just dropped out of the sky one day?
No. I mean, honestly, I have zero training in this space. And, the truth of the matter is that you can't find a more unlikely writer. I just don't. Do I fit the image of a writer? I mean, honestly, if you met me outside of this setting, would you say that I'm a writer or a storyteller? I mean, I'm more likely to be working in a corporate office and, or maybe a banking job or something like that. So my training was entirely in the world of business. As they say, that there are some, 600,000 odd words but the only 2 relevant words that were there for me were debit and credit. So I grew up in the context of a very sort of focused life, and that's the reason I'm an MBA in finance. But I believe, and probably there are people in this audience who would know that that there is a story within everyone. Even though you don't think of yourself as a storyteller, but there is a story which is there within each one of us. It's just that you need to coax it to come out. If I look back at my life's journey, I went through all my education, Cathedral School, Bombay, St. Xavier's College, Yale University, Masters, all of that. But that wasn't my real education. The real education that came to me was probably about 200 or 300 books that my grandfather shared with me, and which he required me to read every week or 10 days, complete, and then send him something in the nature of a book review with the old snail mail. I don't know how many kids are even familiar now with snail mail, but it was the good old precursor to email. And that, in some ways, was rewiring my brain. And I didn't realize that brain had been rewired until around 2002, 2003, when a chance visit to a particular location triggered a story within me. And I ended up then researching that story for the next couple of years. But that is the subject for another question in case it comes. Because you'll have to control me, by the way, because we have limited time. So I have a tendency to wander, so control me when it's needed. So that's how that first story came along. And at that point of time, I didn't know as to whether it was going to do well or not. I was just I just felt blessed that I was getting published. And for someone like me who has no literary training or background or anyone who is famous within that space, the process of trying to get published was also very, very taxing and very, very difficult. It was almost gut-wrenching for those couple of years, until eventually I said, what the hell, I'll just publish it myself. And so it was 2007 when I self-published. And that's something which I believe that process, that 2-year process of trying to get published was very important for me, because it, I think, made me realize how much you need to value the fact that even if there is an audience of 500, even if one person comes up to you and says, I read that book and it blew me away, that's your reward. And so I know we are talking about commercial viability today, and we are talking about creativity versus commercial viability. But actually, you'll realize that the creative process is such that you get your rewards in the most unique ways. And one of those is this.
Right. And if I remember correctly, at that time, there weren't that many Indian authors publishing in English. Of course, we had the illustrious ones, but they weren't as popular, I think, as they are now. The industry has become a lot more is bigger now. Was it really the pull of the story that it was so strong that you had to publish it, even though I don't imagine that you would have thought it was commercially viable back then?
No, the vast majority of the publishers that I went to at that time said, you have to, Mr. Sanghi, what exactly are you smoking? Do you really think that this story is going to work? What were we talking about? It was a book called The Rosabal Line, which no one could understand what it meant. It was a book which explored the overlap between Indic spirituality and the Abrahamic thought process. In certain ways, it was a book which actually irritated a lot of people because many of the stories were around themes that were uncomfortable. And in fact, when I self-published the book, the very first few reviews that came in from ordinary readers were terrible. They were really bad. I mean, I still remember, I used to wait for the Amazon reviews to come up, because then I would look and see what are people thinking. And this lady who was from a magazine, she had written the review, and she wrote, Ashwin Sanghi wrote a good book. He could have made it shorter. Maybe he should have stopped on page 10. And you know, when you haven't been around for a long time, those comments really hurt you. They really hurt you. It's over a period of time that you realize that, listen, buddy, you're in a creative space and you are not going to please everyone. There are people who are going to like you, there are people who are going to love you, and there are people who are going to hate you, and there are going to be people who are indifferent to you. It doesn't matter. That's the very nature of the creative process. How many times do you go in for a movie which is a blockbuster, and you will still have 10% or 20% people coming out and saying, yeah, but you know, they could have done this better, or this could have been nicer. So that's the very nature of this game. And it takes a while to be able to understand that. After this book eventually got published in India by my first mainstream publisher, I'm now not talking about the self-published route. I remember the first review, Your Majesty, it was to appear in the Hindu. And as Shobha will tell you, the Hindu literary review, for guys like me, you know what's coming. You know exactly what's coming. You're going to be, you should be grateful if you're standing the next morning, right? Commercial thriller in the theological realm by a Marwadi businessman. I mean, come on. Okay? And I was waiting for that review, and these were the days when, you know, the Hindu got, I mean, it basically was a Chennai newspaper. So my publisher, Gautam Padmanabhan, I said, Gautam, the moment the review comes out, please send it to me. And he faxed it to me in the morning. It was not the days of scanning and emailing, it was fax. So he sent me the fax. And it was written by a person who had a bit of a reputation for being unkind. And by then, I had gone through 2 years of that self-publication route where all manner of people were taking pot shots at me. And so it was taken for granted that it's going to be a bad review. And he said, his opening line was that we do a great disservice to Ashwin Sanghi by comparing him to Dan Brown because Ashwin is so much more. And then he went on to explain why it was an outstanding book. And I did fall to the ground, but in a different way, because I couldn't believe it. I said, has he read the right book? So I think if you don't get too caught up, with what the end result is going to be, if you're not too tied in to what is going to be, whether it's going to be commercially a success or a failure, if you can allow yourself to be liberated to simply enjoy the process of telling that story, chances are that you have a success on your hands. Chances are.
That's great. Do you still read online reviews, though?
Sorry? Absolutely. Absolutely. In the early days, I used to post my own reviews. Whenever there would be a bad review, I would also post a good review in order to sort of balance it out. But no longer.
All right. I want to get into something that we touched upon a little bit earlier. For your first novel, you said you did 2 years of research, and subsequently also, I think for all your novels, the amount of research, I mean, I was reading your latest book, The Magicians of Mazda, and you know, the amount of research, obviously, that's gone into the amount of facts that is in there, the amount of history that's in there. You know, at times it feels like I'm actually reading something that's teaching me about history, and then I flip the page and I'm suddenly like,
I'm a fiction writer.
In the middle of a thriller, right? Can you tell us about that research, and maybe as part of your entire writing process, where does that research fit in? What comes first? How your characters are created?
So for me, it's most people think of writing as somewhat romantic, emotional. There is nothing emotional about what I do. For me, if I think about it, the first book got published in 2008. 7 books have followed over the next 14 odd years, 14, 15 years. So it's been about roughly 2 years a book. And in that 2 years, typically where it starts with is an idea. Not one idea, but maybe about 2 or 3. I will evaluate which idea will be exciting enough for me to see through 2 years. Because the worry is that if you have an idea which sounds good now, but 6 months later, it bores the hell out of you.
6 days later, often.
Yeah, but when you've already done 50% of your work, you've already written half the book, or you've researched half the book. So you need to live with that idea for the duration of the project. The second part of it is that once I have the idea, then I will develop a list in terms of what is the nature of the research I need to do. So for example, and the nature of the research will be different. Like for example, with Chanakya's chant, it was simply reading the Arthashastra, the Mudra Rakshas, as well as certain other documents and research papers that I felt would be relevant in order to build up some of the ancient strategies around geopolitics. Or for example, the Sialkot saga was basically talking to a lot of people who had lived through the 1950s, 60s, 70s of Bombay and Calcutta. Because how else do you create that flavor? The Krishna key involved going to places like Mathura and Vrindavan. The Vault of Vishnu involved making 2 or 3 trips into China in order to look at the evolution of martial arts and what have you. So the nature of the research will vary. And then once I'm done with that research, I will document all of that research. I have a data bank into which all of that will go so that it's easy to access. Once I'm done with that, then I move into the third stage, which is my plotting. Typically, I write out all my plots on Excel. So every row is a chapter. So I told you, there's nothing emotional about this.
You can't take the business out of the man.
Absolutely. So every row is a chapter where I'll talk about what's happening in the chapter, and I will talk about the research that needs to be tied into that chapter. But more importantly, I will specify the hook where I will leave you in that chapter. And once I'm done with that, which has now taken me 14, 15 months into the process, that's when I start writing. And for me, writing is nothing else but picking up one column from my Excel sheet and churning out a chapter, because I already know exactly what happens in that chapter. And I also know what's going to happen at the end of chapter 120. So at the end of the book, I already know what's going to happen. So for me, that process is rather mechanical. It's the easiest part of the process. When I'm writing a book which is 120 chapters long, I think I'm writing 120 short stories. And I simply make sure that those stories weave their way into one another. So they are all connected. And finally, once I'm done with that, then I go into the process of rewrites. Typically, I will rewrite at least 2 or 3 times before it goes to my editor. Till a couple of years ago, my editor was someone that I loved because she had the most incredible vocabulary of cuss words. And she would use them liberally to describe my work. And we lost her a year and a half ago. And but honestly, that editing process is where you realize the way, that's when you get the diamond to start shining. And so that's what consumes the 2 years.
That's a really interesting process, especially the part about Excel being used in creativity. I mean, that's the kind of story we want to hear, right, in this session.
Absolutely. For those who are interested, most of my writing happens not on Microsoft Word, but on Scrivener. Because I like writing each chapter as a story, and then eventually being able to move around those stories in order to connect them.
Great. I don't think we have much time left, but I want to ask about your writing routines. What does a day look like for you when you're actually, in the thick of the writing process?
It depends on the novel. Chanakya's chant was mostly written in the evenings. It was a very dark story. it excelled in describing the darker aspects of human nature. So in that sense, it was written in the evening, typically when I was already a couple of whiskeys down. Some of the books, like for example, the Krishna Key, were written early in the morning, typically not having lit a cigar, but having lit an agarbatti instead. So, you have a a lot depends, because, the atmosphere does make a difference. Like this morning when I got up and I irrespective of my travel, I am up every morning to write. And today was no exception, even sitting here in Thimphu. And this is the most beautiful place that you can find to write in. So opened the windows of my hotel room, and I could see the hill, and I could see the mist rolling over the hill. And I sat down with my laptop, and I cranked out another 1,200, 1,300 words in the morning. So, yeah. Thank you.
Right, thank you. I think we've run out of time for our session. That went by quick.
Yeah.
We'll open
You didn't control me enough.
It was too fun listening. We'll open the floor to questions now. No? Okay, we have one at the back there and one here.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Ashwin, for a very heartwarming and interesting discussion.
Thank you.
I am Achal from Mayo College, Ajmer. So, as you
Sorry,
said...
you're from?
Mayo College, Ajmer.
Oh, how lovely.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
My dad went there.
Okay.
The son refused to go to any boarding school.
Oh.
Please, carry on.
Yeah, so as you said that those who are writing, especially the aspiring writers and beginners, should not be thinking of the end products,
Yeah.
Meaning the commercial success. So, don't you think it's easier to say, like you said, only after you get the commercial success?
Yeah, absolutely. You're 100% right. It's easy. It's much easier even to talk about failure after you're successful.
Yeah.
So I completely get where you're coming from. My worry is always that if you completely, it's like the previous session that was happening where
AI.
we were talking about AI and the fact that if you're basically sending out a prompt into AI, chances are that you're getting recycled stuff. And the worry with commercial success, when you start pegging it to commercial success, the worry is that you are likely to try and use the same formula that has worked in the past. So I think, honestly, to some extent, I think if you really look at what has been commercially successful, yes, undoubtedly, there is formulaic stuff. Like, for example, when I did my 2 novels with James Patterson, that is a formula thriller.
Yeah.
And it works very well in the West. Typically, if you're going into the stores, you will find that 5 books are James Patterson novels, which are crime thrillers. But that is not to say that other forms, that other genres, like for example, I have still not dabbled with science fiction the way Utsav has, but I want to do it. I have not looked at the paranormal, which I want to look at. I want to look at horror horror interests me deeply. So there are a lot of spaces that one needs to work on. And the worry I always have is that if you start looking only at that commercial success factor, chances are that you're going to limit yourself. When the Rosabal line came out, honestly, no publisher wanted to take it on because it hadn't been done before. They said, this doesn't fall into any category. What do you mean by a theological thriller? So I think it's important to create that space. That's what I meant. That is not to say that the fundamental rules that you need to adopt in order to write it, in order to be able to appeal to a certain segment. I'm not saying you should disregard that.
Yeah, especially in the present times with a lot of competition, I think.
Yeah.
However creative you are and whatever stuff you're writing, I think it's important to market you and yourself. There has to be some plan for that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ashwin. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello? Thank you, Ashwinji. I think you never fail to amaze me, especially your presentation at PMACO, the Dentaj was really amazing. With a lot of students, I think maybe in the next edition, we will really look forward to such presentations.
I look
as well.
forward to
Yes,
that.
And
I look forward to another invitation to Bhutan.
yes, we look forward to that as well. Coming to the question, actually, I was supposed to ask to the earlier presenter, but however, I've twisted the question in a way it suits you as well.
Okay.
Especially in the changing world with AI, chat, GPT, everything. I'm a filmmaker as well. I do try to write screenplays.
Sure.
So there is a growing temptation, especially when you have to meet the deadlines, everything. Whenever there is writer's blockage, to resort to these apps. But then what I've tried is, I've tried to stay away from these modern amenities. So if you can share some light on how it has aided, especially in your writing process.
Sure.
Yes, thank you.
To my mind, you know, I'm certainly not one who says that you should be using Chat GPT to write your novels. Don't get me wrong. But I do believe that you should be leveraging every tool that you can. So, for example, there was a time when when people didn't know any better, they would ask, oh, do you use a computer or do you write by hand? It's one of the most hackneyed questions that writers get asked, right? But the point is, someone like me, my brain refuses to function in an environment where I'm outside the Apple cloud. I need my tablet also, and I need my phone also, and I need my computer also. And because I'm typically sharing information between them, sometimes I'm writing on the go, sometimes I might be writing on a flight, and which will then get uploaded onto the cloud. So that's a tool, it's an advantage, because once I have a word processor, and if I need to make a correction, hypothetically, I need to change the name of a character. In the old days, it would have taken me forever to do, whereas the word processor simply allows me to do that in a jiffy. So I think effectively what's happening is that we've got more and more tools available to us to use. The problem is if you start using that tool to the point where your own original thought process is no longer applicable. And that is where I genuinely believe that if you are a storyteller, I'm not talking about writers, I'm talking about storytellers, that a storyteller will always find a new way of being able to tell that story. I can't remember who it was who said that, you know, storytelling is about either taking things which are familiar and making them sound new, or taking new things and making them sound familiar. And there's a very interesting book by someone called Richard Booker who wrote the 7 basic plots, that all stories fall typically into those 7 plots. So the moment you start digging, you'll find that there are commonalities between stories, right? So what makes it new? What makes it refreshing? This. So to say that I don't use AI, why not? I mean, if I, hypothetically, if I'm right, there is a time when we didn't have Wikipedia. Can you now depend entirely on Wikipedia for your research? No, you go on Wikipedia as your first point. You go on that in order to figure out as to what should be the starting point of your research. And then you eventually go back into the source documents, you try and dig deeper into the archives, you try and find the relevant books that can flesh out your story for you. I believe the same applies with AI, that it can be a great starting point, but eventually the heavy lifting has to be done by you.
All right.
Thank you.
Although it feels like we could continue this conversation for a couple hours more, I think we have run out of time for today. Thank you very much, Ashwin, for being here, for talking to our audience about your career.
Thank you, Utsav. Thank you so much. And thank you for a wonderful audience. You guys have been so interactive. It's been a pleasure to be here. And thank you, Your Majesty, as always, for just being the wonderful soul you are.